Good morning, Leon.
Morning, Howard. Good morning,
Adam.
Adam.
Good morning.
Um, I don't know if you remember, Leon, but one time when we were driving across the southwestern desert in a Porsche with the top down, we had a long discussion. And one of the things you said was that your Washington, D.C. plan was a very important part of your career. It was a great experience, one of the better experiences. And so the question I have is, how did you get involved? And I know there was the story is in the brief of the story for everybody watching at home is in this book, and but it'd be nice to talk about the origin of it, and then the things that came out of it, which I think are of tremendous importance, well beyond Washington D.C. So, how did you get started with Washington D.C.?
Well, there's a certain prehistory to it because, I grew up in Luxembourg, which had been liberated by the American army against the Nazi occupiers. And so we were brought up with America being really a benevolent power, and that its soldiers, its GIs, entered Luxembourg distributing chocolates to children, and, which is a true story. They were really welcome, and we have one of the rare monuments of General Patton. Now, so I grew up with that atmosphere, and we as boys always went to a cinema which we called Te Yank, because it was called The Yank. Giman Te Yank, because we didn't know how to pronounce. And those were always war stories, about Korean War, Second World War. And so we played American soldiers, let's go. That was always the call for attack. Let's go. And but then that story changed when America got involved with the Vietnam War, and then generally the young people like me or my age, we became rather anti-American and or less sympathetic to America, not anti-American, but less sympathetic to America. And this was the story. I came the first time to the United States. I was invited by Oswald Matthias Zungers, who was dean at Yale, at Cornell University. And when I landed in JFK, I never liked New York, even as an idea. And I thought this is just too much, and I didn't like it at all. And I couldn't understand the enthusiasm about New York. And so I had really, and it was difficult with my students at Ithaca to talk even about the war, and they were all like their eyes were glazing over because they didn't know how to deal with it. Huh? And it was in that atmosphere that I was a lot invited to the United States, and I was really shocked by the state of American towns. I was invited to 12 other European architects. And we were sent a year after the Ithaca event, we were sent by Peter Eisenman on an American tour. And I was really shocked by the state of cities and campuses, and how can this be the leading power of the world, to have such terrible cities like Minneapolis or terrible disarray, or St. Louis, and everywhere I was, I found it really in terrible state, impossible to walk, and I even saw. I remember on one of these occasions, I saw. I was in Houston. I saw in the suburb of Houston. I saw the film Network. Do you know the film Network? Very, very important film. Hollywood shows how critical Hollywood at the time was still able to be. And after I walked out of cinema, which was in the suburb, there was no more cars. and no taxi, nothing. So I started walking on the highway towards, I saw Houston on the horizon. And really at night, it was a frightening experience. And I saw suddenly two eyes looking at me. A black guy sitting under one of the super signs, looking at me walking along the highway. And I got really frightened. And then a bus stopped on the highway and said, "What the fuck are you doing here?" I said, "I'm lost. There's no taxi, nothing. I'm just trying to get back to my hotel." So this guy was like a Samaritan. He took me in his bus to the Westminster Hotel in center of Houston. And these were real terrible experience. I understood the whole thing, you know, like the cloning of the environment, the cloning of music, the cloning of language, the utter destruction of the environment and language and culture was on the way. And that music which you heard in the supermarkets, we called it music because that was a make which was then producing this continuous music where you had ups and downs, but without any reason or rhyme. And I thought, this is really, you know, the world of asphalt and concrete. They are liquid materials. You can shape them in any shape, but to give them meaning is a real problem. And then this lasted for years, and I didn't change much my attitude. I went a lot to America and mostly meeting with people who are of a more critical mind. But then I was invited by Jacqueline Robertson, who had become dean at Charlottesville. And he invited me several times and even made me Jefferson professor. And he really instilled in me the love of the United States, what it was meant to be, what it could be, and what in part it was. So he took me to Williamsburg, and you know, I lived in Hotel D on the campus in Charlottesville, and there you see really the attractive part of America. And then also within the family, a very wealthy and very refined family like Jack Robertson's, you see totally different aspect. And he made me fall in love with America and Jefferson, the whole constitutional idea. And then he showed me Williamsburg, and he said, you know, Williamsburg is the best new town of the 20th century, which was like paradoxical, but true statement, because it was a reinvention of 1920s. So there had been an elite growing out of the early developments of Victorian post-Civil War turmoil, who had become extremely critical, not only of industrial production, of what it led to, the terrible strife and slave labor, and, because it was not only a struggle against slavery in the South, but it was a struggle for establishing industrial slavery in the North. I mean, looking coldly at it, huh? Because it was really the advancing phases of industrialization subjected most mankind to kind of slavery, which is only now being replaced by robots. And robots do everything which robots do better was what slave labor was supposed to do. And they don't protest, they work day and night, you know, need a bit of repair. But that is where we are at. And that is where Yuval Harari talks about that we are in the stage of humanity, the development of industrial civilization, developing a useless class, that the majority of people will in the future be useless. So that is the setting, why I'm so critical of industrial development, or the whole idea of progress, because I think idea of progress only makes sense if you have an objective, if you progress towards a declared objective. But now we are progressing towards something which we know is terribly dangerous for the individual and society. And you know, the nightmares we are now experiencing, the first stages of completely controlled society, and of alienated people who will be paid a minimum salary, universal salary, so they stay quiet. But anyway, there was, I thought there was a different story which one could develop, which I had observed because I came from, as I explained before, my father was a craftsman. He came from a family of rather successful tailors. They were the biggest tailors in Luxembourg. And they were extremely aware that production should not be slave labor, that production should be pleasurable and an honorable profession, and that the employees, they are people, they are nice people. My father always worked with the employees, they were like colleagues, they were not like employees, paid minimum salary. And I saw the parallel in Luxembourg, in the reconstruction of Luxembourg I have talked about, where most of the reconstruction in Luxembourg were done in a craft way. So if that was possible to finance under the Marshall Plan, which with the Marshall Plan came also a vast political project to monopolize and to concentrate economic power in the hands of very few, of very large banking and industrial complexes, multinationals. But it was possible within that to have a class of highly skilled craftsmen to compete with them and even be superior in the product. I mean, the reconstructions in Luxembourg, there was only one or two examples in Germany of proper reconstruction, and particularly the reconstruction of Warsaw. They are superb products of human labor, by human hand, where the people who designed and built these were extremely skilled, interesting, sympathetic, good people. And so it is what I connected that because I was reading a lot. I thought Marx was interesting in an analysis, but there was no project. Whereas William Morris was socialist, but no, not totalitarian social, but an idea that you should have, that the future must respect human lives and human capacities and human talents. So I thought that America could have developed in a very different way, because Williamsburg, the incredible development of craft skills in the 20s, which were much published and much seen in the Beaux-Arts, the City Beautiful movement. And you can see it in the White Pine series. It was a magazine produced by the wood industry, which was called White Pine series, which was unbelievably refined instrument to propagate craft skills and measure drawings of historic buildings and so on.
Did you ever read Henry Adams, The Education of Henry Adams, and his thesis on that the dynamo, the internal combustion machine, completely shifted the power base of mankind, especially European-based Judeo-Christian power. But I bring it up because Henry Adams's book, what is it, Marymount, Mount Saint Michel, used to be required reading for all architects before they took their exam, and that was his basis, was the loss of the evils of industrial engine power against craftsmanship. And anyway, so what you're saying, I'm sorry, fit within that theme.
Does.
And I'll back away from that.
No, also in Germany, for instance, there was always commissions since really the event of the industrial age, which started with highly skilled architects, geniuses like Schinkel, who were directly engaged in designing progress, making pattern books, how to produce beautiful things. And also there was a commission always instituted in Germany, which observed what are the undesired effects of development, regulations and laws. And they noticed in the late 19th century that the event of the steam engine produced such a concentration of power, because they were unbelievably expensive instruments, that it would wipe out German craftsmanship, which was the mainstay of the German economy and German culture, German music. You can't think of music and good architecture without craftsmanship. or artists without craftsmanship. That's why we have such absurd artists nowadays who know nothing and pretend to be artists. Whereas the artists grew out traditionally out of craft skills, and then they were the ones who really mastered not only the manuality or one single craft, but became masters on many crafts and could therefore become universal intellects who could control the whole process of producing and planning. But they found out that actually this incredible concentration of power would wipe out basically German culture. And the invention of the diesel engine is a product of that criticism, because the German state, or Prussian state, no, it was the German, it was first German Empire, who commissioned engineers to invent an engine which would allow small economic entities to compete with big trusts. And Diesel won that competition, and for the rest of his life, he was occupied to maintain his name with that engine, because a lot of people tried to steal the idea. We said, we had the same idea, and it's still around. And so there would have been other possibilities, but on the other hand, the kind of totalitarian tendencies within technological development, where the technological development goes beyond philosophic and constitutional thinking, and where everything is drawn into that vortex of technical progress without any moral control, or without any capacity to foresee the consequence. And then you have the dystopias described by 1984 or Aldous Huxley and so on.
Which is a difference, the way that you view the role of capitals, cities, and societies. That's something you were talking about a minute ago with the reconstruction of Luxembourg City and Washington, D.C. But isn't that sort of the opposite of your view of the common good, that the role that capital cities play?
Well, capital cities have basically become engines also of power concentration and really rendering all periphery dependent on these power centers, whether it's Milan or Paris. They still grow and grow beyond reason, desertifying, there is no term really, destroying basically the backcountry. Now, we have similar developments in agriculture or in the economy generally, in finance, which are really out of control. And for instance, the destruction of traditional agriculture is just beyond belief. I mean, it's terribly dangerous with the OGMs and so on, the genetically modified products, of which nobody has a clue what it does to health or to soil. But we go on and on and on and on and on. So that is what I mentioned last time, that our elites are no longer elites. They are technical elites, but they have no clue what they are leading to, whereas we would need an elite which is really, or which assembles enough intellectual gray matter that you can build a project of the future which is relatively predictably safe and beautiful. And therefore, I thought, because America had become by then the world power #1, really desired, not only imitated by the admirers of America, but also the Soviet Union. They lagged behind the United States, but they wanted exactly what the United States produced. They wanted mass consumption.
Blue jeans, right? Wasn't it blue jeans?
It's pop music and all this, the products of our so-called culture. And therefore I thought that America being this power, and then I had a shock, a real shock when I first visited Washington, D.C. I was invited there in '76 to give a lecture at the Smithsonian. And I walked around, I thought, how is it possible? This is the most important power in the world. And Washington, D.C., 2 blocks from the White House, there were slums, people lying in the street, poor people in terribly run-down suburbs, was virtually unwalkable. But on the other hand, there were these fantastic signs of something else. the White House, the Capitol building, the incredible buildings built after the Macmillan Commission, the monuments and so on. Unbelievably inspiring, but basically standing about in a slum. And I lived like a student. I didn't have much family. I didn't have children, so I could afford sometimes to work for 2-3 years without any income. And that's why I refused a lot of jobs as soon as they. I earned quite well, but then if something didn't work out the way I thought it should, I just resigned. And I had often periods of where I could just write a book or just be a year off the production line because I was always invited and published a lot. And so I was then invited in 1984, and Philip Johnson was one of my promoters, who permitted me sometimes, never outspokenly, but he would have my drawings bought by Phyllis Lambert, or I was invited here and there, and the teaching, and I got the Jefferson Prize and things like that. And I was invited to do a project for by Arthur Drexler, was the director of the Museum of Modern Art Design section, to do a project for New York. For New York, I felt absolutely nothing. Any energy spent on New York, I thought, is useless. Just goes down in the overall noise and nervousness and provincialism. I find New York terribly provincial. People think it's the top of the world, but anyway, nothing important can happen in New York because even the best building disappears in this mass of meaninglessness. And so I thought, great. And I was paid quite a lot of money to do a project. So I said, I feel nothing for New York, but I have an enormous love developing for what Washington could be. Well, Adam, you know the feeling about how inspiring Washington can be. These few monuments, I mean, they are like a promise of a different world. And this was before the bad redevelopment started in D.C. in the late 80s. And so to go from slum to a real place, to a real urban development would have been not so difficult. I then traveled a lot to Washington to study documents, go to the libraries, and there was a man, I forget quite his name, but I think he was called Jackson. He was the head of the planning commission, and he was a very nice person. And he received me, and we talked a lot. And it turned out that he was really an enthusiast of the L'Enfant plan. And privately, even though he could do nothing as a planner, he was just a bureaucrat, but he did drawings, lovely little drawings, how the L'Enfant plan would have actually looked if it had been built the way it was. And they always wanted to publish his sketches, but he didn't want to, because he was a very, he was in state commissions and federal commissions, and he didn't want to appear like an artist, and he was basically an administrator. But he got me all the documents, and so I started working on this, and I worked on this for a year.
So what year was that when you started drawing on the Washington, D.C.?
84. And the exhibition was I think in June 85 or May 85. But I spend much more time, because when I do a project, it's really a love story, and I can only work when I'm really overwhelmed by love for what it could be. And so I had unbelievable fun with it. And because I had also all the alternative plans, the Macmillan plans and all the competition drawings which were ever done, I collected this. And at that time, it was difficult to find this material. It was not like today, where you find virtually anything on the web. But also, I could be in DC. I lived like a student, on income of a student, but I lived at the Hay Adams, in a suite at the Hay Adams, which cost $56, overlooking the White House, And I was even there for the inauguration, when the inauguration of the President Reagan happened. I walked down in the in the middle of Washington at 11. I arrived very late, and there was the presidential party traveling around Washington. And you heard it, wow, 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 the police alarms. And I was the only one in the street. And then I was chased away from the Constitution Avenue because the presidential caravan came, and the policeman shouted, "Get the fuck out of here!" And I was the only one looking. And then the president and Nancy came out of the car, waved to 5 journalists in front of the History Museum. And so when you see these published, you think Washington must be a lot of people waving at the president. No, there were 8 journalists and I alone in the side street next to Minister of Commerce looking what was going on. I mean, and this was the main power in the world. And so I worked on this, and it was really like a dream, and I dedicated to Jacqueline Robertson, who had really gotten me into this, and he got me together with Philip Johnson and Robert Stern and all that crowd. And they were really very nice to me, very kind to me. It was exhibited at the Museum of Modern Art, the drawings together with the material by Bofill, because Drexler liked Bofill, and myself, I think I was imposed by Philip Johnson. And then we had the exhibition of the drawings, and the model, the AIA, I think, had paid for a model. There were several sponsors. And we then had the exhibition travel to DC at the Octagon, and we invited President Reagan for the opening, but of course, it was just across the street. Didn't bother. But that is really the fact when you study this involvement of politics nowadays with architecture. Why it's so bad is that power has been disconnected from form, from architectural form, and the necessity for power to have an acceptable face to the citizens, which would make what their action would make it likable, and that their products would become common good. Not just incomprehensible garbage stored in museums and lauded by expert, so-called expert historians and so on. Because architecture and art were the means by which power throughout the ages legitimized itself, and it went right up to the last project like that was Workers' Progress, the WPA project, where there was an aesthetic vision which was promoted by the state to produce beautiful public buildings, to promote the knowledge of traditional architecture in the Historic Building Survey, which was funded by WPA, and produced an enormous revival of great quality in the United States. And I thought, this is what the most important empire in the world must really show to the world. And therefore Washington, which is so incomplete, can become the model of the most beautiful city in the world. And then studying L'Enfant, I realized that L'Enfant was a genius. And what is left of L'Enfant is just a caricature that you should, if you haven't read Scott Burke, The Grand Avenues, it's fantastic book, Scott W. Burke, I think.
Yes.
Two Scott Burkes, but it's Scott Burke. He was a critic of New York Times, of Washington Post. Very good man. I had him meeting on the jury. But that book shows how you have it. Yes, it's very important. Very important. It's unbelievably inspiring book, and shows the traumatic relationship. W. Burke, yes, he's still around. Why United States politicians are so alienated from form, and it already happened with the creation of Washington. L'Enfant was a genius, not only as an architect and as an engineer, but also as an organizer. He was, he built the first Congress building in New York, like within 2 months or 3 months, stone building. no time, and it's like an unbelievable story. And even organized the first festivities, which was like kind of festival processions, to make really the Congress something important to the general public, which would create a law and legends and so on. And when he was engaged by Washington to do, because of, I mean, Scott Burke describes this very well. He then became, he suggested the idea to create, to sign the new Washington, which would replace which would resolve the rivalry between Philadelphia and New York, and then have a new, not only a new city, but a new image for the United States, the country with a constitution which doesn't have a king, and would symbolize this to the world. Because it was only 13 states that, but these people, the founding fathers, were very ambitious. They were no wimps. I mean, they had traveled the world, and Washington, Jefferson lived in Paris. He was an ambassador to Paris. And, so and then Jefferson, who was not a great architect. I mean, he had read a lot. He brought a lot of ideas and books from France, but his idea for Washington were very poor. He was very good at doing the campus in Charlottesville, but his ideas for Washington were very poor, and he really didn't see the genius of of L'Enfant. He didn't support him. And after L'Enfant had done the first drawing, delivered the first drawing, he went almost immediately into conflict with the commissioners. And Washington defended the commissioners and maltreated, really, the plan, and L'Enfant even personally regarded an embittered person. Because not only was his plan then misinterpreted by Ellicott and robbed, his name was removed. And then his genius was rediscovered by people like Burnham and McKim, who created the Macmillan Commission and tried to revive it. So, and I thought that the Macmillan Commission had done beautiful plans, but they were already very much of suburban nature. And they didn't really understand the classism of L'Enfant. No, but because they wanted to line up the capital city, the Washington Memorial, and then the new Lincoln Memorial on one axis, which was kind of an abstract, whereas it would have been much more, let's say, pre-Roman classicism with loose composition of classical buildings, which are much more powerful, as we all experience when we visit old towns. And so I tried to correct the Macmillan plan by bringing back the old axis and then extending the Tiber Creek to something which was, in L'Enfant's plan, the Potomac played a very important role, because he considered it like a lake.
It was the backdrop. It was the backdrop of a lot of these views and vista settings. It was that expanse and that grandness, but then you were adding his idea of the urbanism, the urban condition, whereas before everything was spread, everything was a monument in a park, and you lose that backdrop of the Potomac as that infinity.
He was also, L'Enfant was a French general and an engineer, and he knew France very well. I mean, he knew Versailles, and he knew already the grand projects which had been underway under the French kings. So I think he tried to combine, it was not suburban yet, but he tried to combine grandeur with urbanity, to have very grand city creation on a humongously grand space, which would be the Potomac, and the eastern branch of the Potomac, and to have a city facing such a grand space, because a lake or a river is never too wide. It's just big, but it's grand, and it's that the breath you have in front of the water when you have cities on lakes or cities on the ocean like Nice, or where the grandeur and the intimate scale of town can be combined. And I think he had really a fantastic idea to bring in, to situate the major monuments in such a way that they would be on the high points, on focuses of avenues. And then there was an interesting irony, because one of the best books done on washing, on planning of washing, is Monumental Washing by John Reps. John Reps is a formidable historian with fantastic books. I knew him briefly in Ithaca. He taught at Cornell. He had fantastic collection of French Bastide towns, photographs. He flew with a Piper, making aerial photographs of Bastide towns in southern France. And he did this book in which he had a very, very interesting comment. Right. You know it. Because he said it's ironic that, you know, the tripod, which the American Constitution, which separates powers into the legislative, executive, and judicial, that they should have been represented in the three most important points. And the judicial, in his proposal, in John Reps' proposal, would have been now exactly where the monument of Jefferson is, whereas Jefferson opposed the three-legged stool. He opposed the judicial to have such an important role. And so it's very ironic that in such a vast composition, you have also an irony. And also what I was struck about by Washington is that when the federal city, you had about, I don't know, 60,000 people working there, and only one resident who lives above his shop, the president. It's like my father lived above his workshop, like with a family, and here there's only one person in the whole of the United States capital city who can live above his shop. This is the president. But so I thought we have to allow all these employees of the federal city to live within walking distance of their workplace. And there's so much void between buildings, between the monumental buildings in DC, that you could actually house most of the working population of the federal city within it. Then I tried to demonstrate that by having four federal quarters, the capital city, Jefferson City,
Washington City, and
Washington and Lincoln.
Yeah, and Lincoln, yeah.
And then capital city as separate town. But they were all size of cities. I saw that somebody objected somewhere to that plan. I read something that somebody said, but you reduce the amount of public space of the Mall, which allowed the big meetings, the big Vietnam protests. But on the other hand, it's so vast that even the amount of public space I have is much more than any capital city I know, except maybe Beijing and Moscow.
And you still have the avenues. You still have, you still have these grand promenades still as well. That's not used in DC, like the green, the whatever the large green's called.
But also the square I created under the Capitol, which is no longer just a garden, but the square, you can house 50,000 people there without any problem, without overcrowding.
But that, I believe, one of the most powerful, lasting images and ideas from your plan was the idea of the cities within cities. There are the courtiers within the city. This, that image, and then you were able to take that to zoning. This is bad zoning, and this is better zoning. This is bad planning. This is better planning, and it resonated to this day.
Well, it was actually one interpretation of L'Enfant's plan, because L'Enfant had, you had the United States had at the time 13 states and 13 state ambassadors who would reside in Washington to represent their state. And so he had, I think, 15 or 16 squares. But there were 13 squares or rondelles, which were meant to be the seat of each state. So virtually, and that I interpreted that as being like the central square of not only for a state, but a whole urban quarter, a whole urban district, which would be like a small town in itself. And it's this polycentricity idea which had been promoted. Most important thinkers in that are Eliel Saarinen, the father of Eero Saarinen, who had done a plan for Helsinki in 1912 or so, and particularly Otto Wagner, who had done a plan for Vienna, which is always misunderstood, because he called it the endless metropolis, because he made like a grid over the whole geographic area, and it looks like he just makes a gridded city, but each block of that grid is a town. It's the size of central Vienna. He was not explicit about it, but Eliel Saarinen was, and he wrote a book called The City, which used to be even published when I grew up, where he calls these urban, what I call urban quarter, what just was historically called urban quarters or urban parishes. He called them functional communities, meaning that these communities, which are walkable areas, which have become the traditional neighborhood districts in new urbanism, and there are many different names for this, but that a zone cannot just be a functional zone, except when it's for some toxic, terrible, dangerous use or production. But a real urban quarter must be a total city in itself, like Paris has 21 cities, each with 4 quarters and a town hall. So it's this idea of polycentricity, which is as old as town planning was. It exists already in Iran before Greek city development and Iranian Empire, Babylon, Baghdad, and East. Because it's just a matter of when you build cities and you use cities with animal and human motricity, locomotion, you don't want to be oversized because it's just too tiresome and boring. And so it is this mixity of uses, mixity of meanings, and also particularly significance of different districts, that the capital city is not the same as provincial city or as a capital of a federal state. So there's a hierarchy of meanings, but Washington, D.C. is a capital not just of the United States, but of the world. And therefore it has to be attractive. And so I said, we have to make it such a beauty that people not only imitate America and its what they do now in its worst in the shopping malls and the suburban development and the, I don't know, and all the, what comes with it, but that must become a model for beautiful development, beautiful social development, community development, a model for the world, rather than being now it's basically like gone out of control. Yes, and when they can't get by persuasion, they get by power and by torture and all these horrible things.
Well, how did once you finished the plan and you had the model made and it was displayed, what came next?
It is now in permanent. I think the Museum of Modern Art bought it, and it was a time when I was still quite famous at the time. I mean, I had very easy access to media. It was published. Maurice Culot made a special number of his magazine. It was published very lushly in Japan and even in Germany. But it was just before my Speer book came out. So, and after that, as I described before, I went, voila.
Just so you know, I can't believe how well written it is. I enjoy reading it every time.
Bob Stern saved my life because he held a protective hand over me, because he agreed with the argument, and because it's true. And when evil people do beautiful things, they must be applauded for the beautiful things, not for the evil they have done, but for beautiful things. On the contrary, one must, if one forgets about their beautiful things, one confuses humankind, that who are always extremely complex, and even the best people do sometimes terrible things. And so architecture is something which any regime of any, whether it's democratic or totalitarian, must always revere beauty, that what they leave behind must be usable and attractive to those who come behind us.
Yeah.
Because if it is not attractive to those who become behind us, even we can't enjoy it. Because I was, when I observed Massimo Scolari, my best friend, when he did his watercolors, his watercolors, he does the most beautiful watercolors you can imagine. But I understood that you can only enjoy a work of art, you can only take pleasure at looking at the work of art if the artist experienced that pleasure in producing it. If a cook hates cooking, he can't.
You
can't
can
cook.
tell. It comes out. It reveals itself.
Yes, and you will go sick. Whereas life, if it's not love, I mean, love is the most important thing. But I think there's really a terrible philosophic error with Christianism. I mean, I love Christianism. I was brought up that way, but it is wrong to impose love. You cannot impose love. You love or you don't. But you can impose tolerance and respect, which is a form of love, but on a low burner, and you keep your distance. But you cannot be forced to love something, and that led to terrible consequences, politically, in family lives, and this tyranny which we are surrounded by, is that people are made to love. You are born out of love, and if you are treated well by your parents, you love your parents, they love you, and so it is that which drives the world, and it's the beauty which we admire, which makes one love, and what our friend in Miami calls lovable buildings. What's his name again?
Steve Muzon.
Steve Muzon. It's a great term, lovable. That what we do must be lovable. Otherwise, people will if you can't love it, you either hate it or you just don't judge. But that is a mistake, because you cannot not judge. Because love decides in a second whether something is worth loving or not. You don't need an explanation. And when you deny that judgment, that spontaneous judgment, you destroy your own judgment. It still survives, but it really pesters you. And that is why people get embarrassed to like when they see a building like this cover of the Speerbook. I mean, wow. But then they are not allowed to say it. This is really great. This would have been great to be built. Well, with the hope that Hitler and all the Nazi thugs would have died, but they would have left us, which would have been the main touristic attraction of the world. I mean, can you imagine that space, 280 meters high inside?
Yeah.
Anyway.
So we're at, so that actually, I think that's a great way to end, but I would like to give you the opportunity. Anything from your Washington D.C. project that resonates with you personally? Anything that you'd like to end the conversation on Washington D.C. with?
Well, my scheme for Washington was also a declaration of love of American classicism, which was something very particular, the American Beaux-Arts, and the Golden City described by Henry Hope Reed, and which had been realized. I mean, the Chicago '93 White City, the World Fair, was an unbelievable achievement. And the atmosphere which was created around that, the water, would have been worth building in solid. Those buildings were invented in no time. And what's the ghost in the city, or what is the book called by Larson?
Devil in the White City.
Yeah, it's fantastic book. But the skill which was displayed by those people, the craft which was displayed by those people, is just unbelievable. And I revived the Richard Hunt. Is that his name? Richard Hunt? Building, the administration building from the Chicago Fair. I put it in my in my Lincoln quarter on the lake, on Pyramid Lake, It's fantastic, fantastic building, most beautiful building ever designed in America. And so it's really to reopen that world of skills, and it is now on the way. I mean, there are a lot of classes who are being trained into our capable architects. The unfortunate thing is that politics are not yet woken up to, and that's why the Trump's thing, and even his wife's tennis, tennis. Have you seen the tennis pavilion designed by his wife?
Yeah.
She was brought up in Ljubljana, and Ljubljana is the Croatian capital of architecture, which was Plečnik. There were unbelievable masters that worked there, and so it's probably comes, this whole interest in classicism probably comes from Melania. Is that the name?
Yeah, Melania. Yeah, wow.
So you may not like Trump, but you will like if that has consequences in good architecture, and it has been demonstrated not by living architects that can be done superbly, like Bob Stern or Tom Beebe, Anders Duani, all these these people who are now building, or Stefanos, Polizoides. It can be done, and people have the choice. And that is what America is about: choice, and therefore
tolerance.
Tolerance and choice, yes. Yeah. That is what's now being killed by these totalitarian controls.
Well, that excellent. We are at 1 hour. We did it.
Great.
I think that's a very good conversation. I love it. Thank you very much, Leon.
Thank you.